So this morning, I want to start by making a huge statement right away. One that I pray you'll never forget. And it's this: waiting is hard. You already know that. It's really not a big statement, but it is, because even though we know it's true, we push against waiting. There's a verse that we kind of have this love-hate relationship with. It's 2 Peter 3:8. It says, "Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." We love the truth that God is so patient with us. We need all the patience that we can get. Well, at the same time, we need Him to take a 1-second approach with our problem, not a 1,000-year approach. We hate what we consider the slowness of God. By the way, 1 second, if I did my math right, equals less than a day, if a day is like 1,000 years. So I called the message, "Embrace the Wait," not because I'm saying we take that and the sense of waiting is not an eager waiting, but in a willingness to wait. Not by throwing up our hands and say, if I have to wait, then I guess I'll do it. But shifting our perspective just a small amount to take a learning posture. Since I am waiting, what does God want of me? I'm convinced that in the waiting is where God transforms us. Waiting is God's grace in our lives. There's another verse we tend to go to often. "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." We're transformed by having a shift in perspective. And it's much more difficult to become more Christ-like if we fight against the tools that God uses to change us, to transform us. Can we willingly wait, trusting that God is doing His good, pleasing, and perfect will? So today we come to the fruition of waiting for Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 21 is the birth of the promised boy, finally. It says this in the first 5 verses: "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as He had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what He had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time that God had promised. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him, and when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him." Time is grace. We don't think so, but it's still true. Grace means God's promises all come to be. You see, grace follows through on the promise. If there was no grace, the promise would easily be annulled, because God always has a reason to not keep His word, because we sin. We never deserve His pleasure and blessing, but I think that's why the text begins with those words: "The Lord was gracious to Sarah." You see, God's complete plan is wrapped fully in grace. This morning we're looking at the 3 players in this scene, and it starts with God. God who does His part always. When things are just right in God's eyes, when the right moment has arrived, God acts always. Just a reminder, verse 1, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as He said. The Lord did for Sarah what He had promised, and she became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised." Now, I loved holding our babies. Well, except for in the middle of the night. But once we knew a baby was on the way, the joy began to build, and it would grow in the months leading up to the arrival. Imagine Abraham and Sarah's joy the day they long awaited that baby to come. 9 months was nothing. They waited 25 years since God first promised the baby boy. You see, God had a plan, not for months, not for 9 months, but for years of waiting. God set His time for His purpose. We often don't know what His time is because we don't know the whole picture, and so we must wait. Think about this. If God had told Abram, when he first gave the promise, that it would be 25 years until they held the baby in their arms, how would Abraham dealt with that news? Here's the couple, Abraham and Sarah. They can't seem to get pregnant. They've been trying for years. Then God arrives and says, hey, don't worry, you'll have a baby in 25 years when you're about 100. How would that go over? I believe that it was God's gracious love that didn't give Abram and Sarai the timetable at the very beginning. The 25 long years ahead were not divulged because it would have been too much to bear. It would have felt way too overwhelming. And I think it would have put even more stress in their home. You see, that culture was baby boy driven, plus this boy had an even greater role for all of humanity. And so God actually just gave them a few months of waiting with full knowledge. Genesis 18, it says, is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. See, God is graciously telling them that the wait is almost over. Sarah didn't have to take a pregnancy test to know that in what probably felt a very short time comparatively, that she would be a mom. Here we see that God is never early or late. When he sets a timeline, he meets it. And this baby's birth brought far more joy than to just his parents. The birth was another spotlight on the truth that God fulfills the promise. When God called Abraham, he promised to make him a great nation and to bless the whole world in chapter 12. And then he repeated that promise to give the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants and to multiply them greatly. He repeated also that Abraham would be the father of the promised seed and that Sarah, not Hagar, would be the mother. You see, the birth of Isaac reminds us that God keeps his promise in his way and in his time. Isaac's birth is a reward of patience, even when that patience wavered along the way, and it did. Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years, and so much happened in those 25 years. Patience and perseverance are such important pieces for us to live God-centered. The writer of Hebrews encourages us with a couple of verses. In Hebrews 6, it says, we want each of you to show the same diligence to the very end, to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. And then chapter 10, it says, we need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. Now, I don't know what the writer of Hebrews had in his mind when he wrote those words, but I read those words and I can see Abraham and Sarah in them. You see, trusting God's promises not only gives us a blessing in the end, but we grow in godliness and faith as we learn to willingly wait for God's promises to happen. See, faith is a journey. And each time that we reach a destination, it's also the beginning of a new journey. And when God wants to build our faith, he gives us promises. He sends us trials. And then he tells us to trust him. And then Abraham, he's the next character. Abraham, he demonstrates a deepening faith. We've seen several times that Abraham's wavering faith. And although we skipped chapter 20 in this overview, we can take a quick peek there and we see that Abraham once again called Sarah his sister and Abimelech took her into his household. To us it feels like Abraham, he just keeps messing up. And he does. But if someone wrote about my life, I think they would see the same thing. Our faith journey is never simply and gradually always on this nice upgrade. It's more like that roller coaster that goes up and down and up and down. And Abraham, is like that, and yet at the birth of the boy, after the long waiting, he makes a clear statement of faith. Abraham, it says, gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old. You see, Isaac means he laughs. And it feels like the right name, doesn't it, when you consider the irony of the age of Abraham and Sarah. And the laughter that Sarah had when she first overheard the 3 visitors that said she was going to get pregnant back in chapter 18. But more than that, consider the laughter, the joy in the hearts of Abraham and Sarah when this baby was born. You see, the name reflects delight, a delight that they had as parents. But I also think that Abraham in some way understood, based on God's promises, that God would use Isaac to bring delight to the whole world. See, the naming of Isaac is significant, but Abraham's main demonstration of faith is in his obedience. When Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham fulfilled the outward mark of the covenant. Remember Genesis 17:10, it says, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. The covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Abraham didn't waver on being obedient to God's covenant the very first time. When God first mandated circumcision, Abraham immediately followed through, and we see the exact same thing here. There was no negotiating or uncertainty in Abraham's heart. Day 8 came and circumcision happened. I said the outward mark because this was the physical nation of Israel, God's chosen people. But Paul tells us that the true circumcision is in our heart. The heart identifies us as followers of Jesus, not something on the outside, but it's our inside. Romans 2:29, it says, "No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. And such a person's praise is not from people, but from God." So Abraham's action demonstrates a deepening of faith, and then Sarah embraces faith. Now, whenever I read through these chapters and I see Sarah, it feels to me like she's struggling to be faithful. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's the way it feels to me until we get to chapter 21. God was gracious to Sarah, it says. But don't stop there. The rest of verse 1 says, "And the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised." The Lord did for Sarah. Not he did to Sarah, but he did for Sarah what was promised to Abraham. Obviously, Sarah was a huge part of the plan. Verse 6, it says, Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? And yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Before this, we read that she laughed at the angel's announcement. She lived longing for the baby. She longed to have the promise fulfilled. And she actually worked for Abraham to have his son, even though things went badly and the plan wasn't good with Hagar and Ishmael. I think it was Sarah's desire to be active in her faith, even though she went about it the wrong way. The truth is, she failed, but not permanently. We fail, but not permanently. The words of Hebrews tells me that her faith made room to trust God, and it's the inside that counts. It says, "By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise." In all our struggling, in all our waiting and pain, she came to the place where she embraced her faith. She embraced it figuratively and then finally physically. It's hard for me to know how she felt as she held that baby boy, so much earthly pain was peeled away because she was no longer barren. So much chasing after the goal was silenced as she held Isaac close to her. The weight of waiting and wanting was released. I think there are times along the way when she felt that all hope was gone. I think there were times when she thought, man, I must have misheard God or misinterpreted what he was saying to Abraham. 25 years will do that. We do the same thing. We question rather than turning to God and saying, what do you want from me during this time? But when all human methods were exhausted, God did the impossible, and Sarah rejoiced, embracing the faith. I think we'd do well to take to heart Ecclesiastes 3 and embrace the truth of these verses. There's a time for everything. A season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance. There is a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up. There is a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. There is a time, and God is not accidentally ever late. He doesn't have a plan that's based on what we want and what we like. We can't manipulate the season of waiting, but we can implore God to give us strength and patience. We can storm His doors with our prayers, but those prayers must always express our trust in Him, because if they don't, then we're just asking for our own reasons and for our own relief rather than for His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So can we embrace the wait? By embracing, I mean that willing, knowing that waiting produces patience, patience produces character, and character produces hope that will be fulfilled. Right now, the question is, can we embrace the wait? The wait of gathering together. We all want to get together. I want to get together and come back into this building to have it buzzing like pre-COVID times. We all miss that gathering time together. This is a strange season, and I often hear the word unprecedented, and it can't be said enough. First, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding as we continue to monitor the current status of COVID-19 with the updates from our provincial health officers, from the BC Centre of Disease Control, and from our regional places. Every month, the Richmond Baptist Leadership Board and our staff wrestle with what would work best in our church setting. While we're eager to gather together for worship, at this time we've decided to wait before resuming our in-person weekend services. Your health and well-being is always of utmost importance, and we want to ensure that we're doing our part to curb the spread of the virus and be compliant with our government directives that continue to prohibit gatherings of more than 50 people. So our decision is to continue to meet for worship remotely, which focuses our energy, our resources, and capacity on one mode of worship and offers our best to you. It allows us to prioritize our energy on where we can have the greatest impact and where that will be. I believe being flexible is both a skill and a gift that helps us work together. The slogan we had before, that we can do more together, is just as important today, even though it looks different for the time being. But let me encourage you to look at 5 things. First, join a Community 411 group. These small groups are great places to get the connection that we're longing for. If the Community 411 group that you're a part of is gathering, then you can gather on Sunday morning at 10:30, following the government guidelines of social distance, hygiene, and all of those things we continue to hear. Maybe you have another family group already in your bubble. Consider gathering with them. Again, following the guidelines, but even having another family can have that sense of worshiping that can ease the sense of loss that we feel. A third thing I'm thinking is build a routine, a family routine of worship. Just like you do on Sunday morning, if we're gathering in here, you would come at 10:30 or 10:45 or whatever time, and you would make it a part of your morning routine. And that would be a good thing, because this is worship time, and our kids need to know that too. And a fourth thing is commit to keep your kids connected to God. Whether it's RBK, the RB Tweens, or our youth. I know Jared and Andrew are working at ways of staying connected with our youth. I know that Priscilla is making all the resources of our curriculum available to parents. And again, build a routine. Routine is so important for people to feel the sense of belonging, this time together. And then the fifth thing, and we implore that you do all these things to be connected, but this one is pray and pray and pray some more. For us as leadership through this season, say, can we embrace the weight? Asking the question, what does God want of us? And that's where we are. And pray that we would be innovative, because our whole desire is not to build a church that has to come together, but to be innovative in sharing the gospel of love and hope in our community. And even by not gathering together, it shows our community that we care about them. And so reach out to your neighbors, do things to share the love and hope of Jesus Christ, and pray for us as we continue to look for His leading, His guiding, and His direction. So let's embrace the weight, trusting God to move us forward and to give glory and honor to His name.